Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program from Washington. On today's show, the freedom of expression and the mass media in the USA. Our guest, Sam Husseini, Director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. Sam Husseini, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
What is the situation regarding the freedom of expression and the mass media today in the USA?
It's worsening. There are a whole series of constraints, ownership, advertisers, and up until recently one could say that the US was relatively free of direct government control. This is eroding. There is more clampdown in terms of sources, i.e. whistleblowers, for example, as well as other ways that the government is colluding to a greater degree with corporations that own the vast majority of news outlets in the United States.
So how would you compare this period with previous periods of government?
I think that one could say that there was a relatively more free period over the last several decades that probably began in the 1980s, but certainly since 9/11 has steadily eroded. And under the Obama administration, we've seen things like the war on whistleblowers, which is fundamentally a war on media sources, that the public's right to know critical information inside the government.
Well, you know that I did have the opportunity to interview Julian Assange for the first time since he got into the embassy of Ecuador in London, and he has information that at the moment that he could be taken to Sweden, the idea is to extradite him to the US. Mm-hmm. He knows by his sources that there's already a secret grand jury and it's already a secret indictment against him.
He's just one case. There are others. For example, the government seems to be targeting James Risen of the New York Times for stories that he has done in terms of
he could end up in jail.
Conceivably, that is still on the table as we speak. So there's a whole series, and there have been other whistleblowers that have been prosecuted by the government. This is part of the worsening of it. And ultimately, what one has to keep in mind that broadcast media in the United States is, in a sense, explicitly government regulated because they all depend on FCC licenses. And you could well have a threat of revoking FCC licenses. That was actually sort of brought up in the Watergate case, that the government could conceivably have gone after the Washington Post in that
Well,
case.
In the building behind you, it's written in the wall, the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, and it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. If the founding fathers will wake up today and see the reality, what will be their reaction, you think?
I think that in a sense they would be repelled, that indeed there are all kinds of restrictions on freedom of the speech and freedom of the press. The history of the United States has been twofold. You've expanded the franchise. It now includes women, it now includes African Americans, it now includes white males who don't own property. When they wrote those words, those rights only applied to privileged white males. So they actually meant something. The trajectory of the United States history has been to dilute the meaning of those words as you've expanded the franchise. So more people have those rights, but those rights mean less and less.
And the ownership of the big mass media corporations in few hands hinders or not the freedom of expression?
I think it definitely hinders the freedom of expression, and that's a great mechanism of control. I think that there are other ways that the controls are there, but ownership is clearly up there. There's also advertising pressure. There's just simple ideological pressure. For example, we have National Public Radio in the United States, but it
funded by the Congress.
Funded by the Congress, but also increasingly funded by corporations. They have what they call underwriting enhancements, which are basically commercials, but nobody calls them commercials. So there's, in effect, a layer of advertising pressure even in that realm. And there's a general ideological constraints that people weigh down virtually all U.S. media.
The government controls the media controls the government. Who dictates the agenda of what is being said, written, or reported?
I think it goes both ways. There are times, for example, where the media outflank the administration on a given issue and attack it if it's doing something that's relatively progressive. I think that Obama has been very militaristic in his foreign policy, but the main critique in the media is he's not militaristic enough. We saw the same pattern under Clinton. Well, why hasn't he bombed Iraq already? And now we see it again under Obama. So I think the cliche that the government controls the media doesn't apply in the United States. It's sort of the shadow of the economic system controls both media and government. And so there's an interplay between media and government.
Precisely. We're talking about the economy system.
Yes.
According to Christine Lagarde, the director of the International Monetary Fund, and according to all the sources, after the crisis of 2008, 95% of the profits ended up in the hands of the 1% of the population, and 90% of the population got poorer. In such panorama, that sort of distribution of wealth that is increasing inequality, does it has an impact on freedom of expression and the mass media?
Yes, in terms of the narrowness of the ownership of the media and ultimately who they're beholden to, their stockholders, and so on. I think that's clearly a mechanism of control. But it's important to note, despite the restrictions, despite things, the U.S. is still a relatively free society. And there are all kinds of ways and mechanisms that one can attempt to challenge power, to question power, and so on. With very meager resources, I've tried to do it in my work. Other people have as well. And I think that to some sense, the greatest problem is a lack of vibrancy. The 1%, the slogan came out of the Occupy movement, but for various reasons that fizzled away. And part of it was a direct police clampdown, but part of it was also lack of fight among sectors of the U.S. public that I think needs to have genuine energy injected into it.
What would be the state of democracy based that the 1% of the population in a way dictates what the other 99% consumes in a way, even in information eventually? What will be the state of democracy in this country?
It's not too different than what we have. I think they, through advertising, through the programs, through the assumptions in the programs, it's a very sophisticated mechanism. Even forms of dissent, like the big shows for a lot of the people are things like The Daily Show and Colbert. These are comedy shows that do a lot of news. They have a lot of assumptions in those programs that are very functional to the establishment. And it's a very sophisticated system of appearing to go against the trend while in fact solidifying consumerism, solidifying the general corporate crony capitalist structure while making fun of it in some way, but it leads to an apathy, a sense that change cannot come. And that's one of the things that various media sell to the American public.
They're like part of the system, if you want, even criticizing the system. And how would you read the fact that if 99% of the population is getting poorer, if 1% is concentrating all the wealth, that 99% we don't see it reacting, and there is clearly trends that the quality of life of the middle class, for example, is going down. Why not to see that reaction in the media?
Yes, you want to see it in the media, but the media will, of course, misrepresent it or ignore it. most of the time. With the Occupy movement, they sort of couldn't, but there have been severe flaws in movements in the United States. They tend to come not near the election cycle, for example. There's a bit more breathing room when there isn't an election going on, and that's when Occupy happened. So it had very little impact in terms of the electoral system, which I think was tragic.
Even there is information with the photocopies that while doing some demonstrations in New York, the people of the Occupy movement around Wall Street, the people of the FBI were taking pictures and names and become part of a list of suspects, even go further, suspects of terrorism, until which point the system accepts the dissent.
The media might cover a story like that, but they don't emphasize it. It deflates people in the movement. They feel afraid, and rather than step it up a notch, many of them decide to
silence it.
To be silent, there's what's called the spiral of silence. When you get more silent, you get more silent because fewer people are speaking up, and therefore people think that they're alone in their thoughts, that they think that everything, that the system is
deliberate?
corrupt. It's hard to know whether it's deliberate or it's just simply, a Tyrannosaurus Rex havoc. But if you asked it how it wreaks havoc, it wouldn't know. It's difficult to know how much of that is genuinely conscious in the institutions that carry these out. And I should say, even institutions, I've criticized institutions that one regards as positive and reformist. For example, something like Al Jazeera, I think in the Arab uprisings, played a positive role up until the fall of Mubarak, and then shifted. It immediately then focused on the uprisings in the secular states of Libya and Syria, where you could see where things were going to go. Civil wars.
And why?
Long drawn out civil wars. Because ultimately Qatar is, the Qatari regime
exactly.
owns and controls the network. And so that's a genuine problem when you had the monarchies sort of rallying around themselves. There was even talk then of Jordan and Morocco joining the GCC during the beginning of the uprisings. They didn't do so, but they in effect gave them part of their umbrella, so that, if you're somebody who wants to risk their life to overthrow a corrupt government, you might do so if you think that the world will know of your efforts. But if you're an activist in a monarchy and Al Jazeera is not covering, you're not going to go out and risk your life. You'll feel foolish. You're risking your life and no one even knows of it. So that I think shifted and tragically the Arab uprisings, so that they ended up consolidating the power of the Saudi regime and the other Gulf states, as we see now. That they, in effect, get to cast a shadow and determine the future of Syria and other states.
Would you say, for example, that information is something that is being prepared a la carte?
A la carte would mean that people get to choose.
A la carte means that you can decide which ingredients you want to put in and which ones you want to leave out.
But it's not being chosen by the publics. Yes. Oh, okay. I thought you meant by the publics.
No. What I mean is by the producers of information.
Yes, absolutely. A great deal of thought and different levels of filters happen. To pursue the example of Al Jazeera, their webpage is relatively open. Their video stream online, which is no longer widely available in the United States, Al Jazeera English, is more closed but still somewhat open. What they put on cable TV in the United States, Al Jazeera America, is quite closed and quite similar to other corporate media. It has more depth sometimes, but in terms of orientation, it's remarkably
so in
similar.
a way it's prepared a la carte of what they believe that is convenient for the business of or political influence, or trying to get business in terms of advertising and revenues.
Well, not in the case of Al Jazeera. I don't think they care about advertising in that case, but I think that's a typical constraint. Although it's advertising in an environment that's conducive to your advertising. It's not simply ratings driven. It's not, if you get a big audience. I could imagine a lot of things that might get a big audience. There are other examples of, there's a nationalist thing, so that you have different media that are on the global stage now. Al Jazeera is the big breakthrough, but you had France 24 and Press TV from Iran,
RT.
China, RT, of course, as well as Telesur. So, although Telesur, I should say, is multi, it's different than the others, and it's not just one country. It is
exactly. It's a worldwide reach.
So, but you still have sort of the lens of different nationalities or perspectives, and it's difficult to get a genuinely global lens. It's most of these players are doing what they're doing because of ideological constraints based on their national self-interest. It's sort of similar. In its history, the United States had press that was party-based. So the newspaper would be allied with a political party. And the objective journalism that we see in the United States now, for the most part, is a relatively new phenomenon.
Do you really believe there is an objective journalism?
No, I don't. I think any serious person attempts to strive for objectivity, but for someone to say that they are objective.
There is this famous phrase that says, the one who pays the piper calls the tune.
Yes.
And that is happening all over the country and all over the world?
Yes, I think with most media outlets, and I think that, what you had in some instances in the United States was viewers paying for the programming. That was the initial idea for public radio in the United States. Pacifica actually invented that, a small radio network in the United States. But they, for a variety of reasons, have never been able to cast themselves to capture a mass audience.
How would you compare private-owned television in the U.S. to public television in the U.S.?
Public television is occasionally more in-depth, but in terms of the ideological viewpoint, it's remarkably similar. The exception to that is Pacifica, but it has suffered, in my view, from a loss of nerve. So, for example, Pacifica has never attempted to get a correspondent in the White House to ask tough questions. There are openings in the U.S. media system, and unfortunately, there are failures among progressive institutions to pursue those openings in a meaningful way.
Because of fear? Because of what?
Because of fear, because of infighting, because of a fear of making a difference, because it's so much easier to,
to go with the flow.
Either to go with the flow or to just stand on the sidelines and critique things and mumble to yourself and to speak to the 2%, the active portion of the population that agrees with you, instead of having to do your homework and actually confront people that you say that you have a problem with. That requires more meaningful effort.
And in a way, that is a crusade that you are in. That is basically your big concern, why the tough question is not coming, why the independence of the media could be better and it's not. Is that where you are in?
That's, I think, a large part of what's needed, and I've tried to contribute to that, whether it's at the press club or occasionally with officials coming out of the Sunday morning talk shows. I have tried to ask them tough questions, and sometimes just empirical questions. Do you acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons? Is one of my favorite, and it's amazing that officials will not acknowledge this fact. But it highlights that so much of the rhetoric, so much of what officialdom says and sees is based on falsehoods, known falsehoods. You don't need WikiLeaks to tell you some of the most obvious things.
Sometimes when you are watching the way news or information is presented in the US, when you're watching it from another perspective or from another country, you could identify sort of a binary way to present the things. Or you are with me, or you're with the enemy.
Yes.
We eventually could be good, the other is evil. Why do you think that, for example, when they're talking about many times the US government identify like rogue states?
Yes.
We're talking about the case of, for example, Cuba, Venezuela. Basically, they are systematically bashing what is not in that binary world good.
Right.
Is that too simplistic to put things in black and white?
It's remarkable that, I remember in the case of Cuba, they actually Cuba happened to be on the Security Council when the U.S. was building up to the original Iraq War under James Baker. And they actually had contact with the Cubans to see, with the Soviet Union collapsing, would they come into their sphere, and then they'll get a pass, and suddenly human rights in Cuba probably wouldn't matter so much anymore, alleged human rights concerns. So it's, if you are with us, as you say, and George Bush said this explicitly, and Obama in effect says it implicitly, you're either with us or with the terrorists, and if you ask serious questions, whether you're a small journalist like me or a country, on the global stage, asking the United States serious questions,
you become in the blacklist.
Then you're on the outs. You're a problem. Now
So-
it depends how hard that escalates. A lot of countries, of course, just give lip service to critiquing the United States, and whether they mean it or not is questionable.
Problem we identified, if you want, quote unquote, the problem. What are the solutions that you're proposing?
One is, as I've indicated, asking tough questions, including, global media in the United States, getting into the State Department, the White House, and so on. There will be certainly constraints, and there could well be reprisals, but it's doable. A friend of mine from Corporate Crime Reporter, Russell Mokhiber, got into the White House for years. He's a one-man operation. And he was asking Ari Fleischer, the Bush spokesperson, tough questions, getting them on the web, getting some meaningful traffic. I think that it tends to be idealized, but there is serious opportunities in terms of technology. You do have individual writers now, Twitter and so on, who have a following.
Social media.
Yes, and it's constrained as well. Facebook doesn't let you know why certain things appear prominent and certain things don't appear prominent. Twitter could become more and more like that. Twitter is now more transparent. That could change. The nature of the internet, of the World Wide Web, does still, because its natural form is to be a relatively open system, and they sort of have to impose structures to limit that, is still there. You could, for example, have a global live stream right now that would go from event to event, whether it's in Ferguson or Iraq or a protest, against climate change going on. And in the United States, we have C-SPAN that sort of does this from a relatively constrained but factual point of view. That could be done on the global stage, and it could be presented in a way that actually provokes critical thought. For example, the lower third of the screen could be used to question what the speaker is saying, a news conference by Obama, so that it would be a place where people could go to say, oh, a news conference is happening, a protest is happening. I know that this place, globalfeed.org or something, will carry this, and it'll have information through the lower third or through commentary immediately after. This is sort of what CNN was at the beginning. CNN at the beginning was the news as the star.
Right.
And it
It didn't work.
that was a long way away. Well, it didn't work for them, for their time, for their economic model. They're a private corporation, now tied up with a huge conglomerate with major advertisers. But for a global network that wants to use the open internet, not cable, as its mechanism, it could work.
How do you see the future?
I would try to be realistic, and I see both that the establishment media is indeed in less and less hands, but that there are opportunities both through activism, through people taking journalism seriously, and people attempting to use technology creatively.
Sam Husseini, thank you very much.
Thank you.